Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Parsha Shiur. I chose to dedicate this Shiur in memory of an Ilui Nishmas, Rabbi Sacks. Of course, this week was his first Yartzheit, and also to share an idea of his on the Parsha. In essence, this is really an elaboration of a Dvar Torah that he writes in his Conversation and Covenantal Conversation series. And it's just an expansion of this core idea which he writes about and which reflects many of the themes that I think were quite central to his thinking. I apologize again that this Shiur is over Zoom. In Hashem, this will be our the last one that's only over Zoom, and we'll go back to the hybrid model of live and Zoom next week when I'm able to be back on site in Shul. I've posted the handout in the, for those that didn't manage to download it in advance of the Shiur. The handout can be found on the WhatsApp groups and also the Shul email, and also in the chat function in on the Zoom account. So the question that we set ourselves in this week's Sedra that Rabbi Sacks raises is really the bulk of our Parsha, the bulk of the Sedra contains two very lengthy episodes describing in great detail, first of all, the purchase of Ma'oras HaMachpelah, the land near Hebron, the field and the cave that Avram bought for the purpose of the Kavurah, the burial of Sarah, and really the first Jewish ownership, the first ownership by Avram of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel. And the Torah goes into great detail to describe the negotiation process, the complexities and difficulties that Avram faced in purchasing and buying this land. And this takes up a significant part of the Sedra, the backwards and forwards between Avram and the Bnei Ches and Ephron in achieving this purchase. The Parsha then carries on, and there's another exceptionally lengthy episode which describes the selection and bringing home of the great future wife of Yitzchak, Rivka, and again, enormous length outlining how she made herself known, or Hashem made her known ultimately to Eliezer, the agent of Avram, and the negotiations to get her back to the land of Israel and her eventual establishment in the home of Avram as the wife of Yitzchak. And again, this takes up a very bulky portion of the Sedra. Now, the grave difficulty really with both of these is what is this length about? Why do we need to know so much of the details of both these events and the negotiations? Negotiations, by the way, not with particularly good characters, with an Ephron, with a Besuel, with a Lavan. Why is this an important part of the narrative of the Torah? And the truth is there's many levels of answers to this question. I think in previous years we've explored, I don't think we've ever explored actually the purchase of Ma'oras HaMachpelah, but we've definitely explored the negotiations between Eliezer and Besuel and the confrontation or encounter rather with Rivka. So we've discussed some of the moral lessons that Chazal learn, and there's certainly details of the story that we can learn much from. But the overall length of the story and its purpose in this sort of narrative of the Others remains more than a little confusing. And I'm going to share simply one approach to this, a springboard that Rabbi Sacks uses for a very fascinating and thematic discussion like that of something that I think is fairly central to his thoughts. And he says that we need to understand that these episodes are embedded in the middle of a sequence of Parshias in which no less than 5 times Hashem promises to Avram future progeny, and no less than 5 times Hashem promises to Avram Eretz Yisrael. So if we really look at the themes of Lech Lecha, Vayera, and to a lesser degree Chayei, this one of the central types of communication that take place between Hashem and Avram is this constant reiteration of 2 promises or 2 commitments. The first promise is Eretz Yisrael, you will get Eretz Yisrael. This will definitely happen. One day the land through which you have traveled, the land of Canaan, will be yours. And the second promise is that of children, family, not just a single child, but a great nation that will emerge from you. And these psukim just come up again and again and again in Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk 7. Hashem says, I will give you this land. Avram built a Mizbeach in chapter 13, which I printed on the source sheets. In chapter 15, twice, Hashem says, I'm HaKadosh Baruch Hu, took you out of all custom to give you this land. I'll give you the land of the Canaani and the Kenizi and the Prazi, etc. Again in Perek 15. And then finally in Perek 17, again, I printed this, yet again, the promise to give Eretz Yisrael. And similarly, the children, 5 times Avram is promised this commitment that he will have a great nation coming out of him, children as many as the stars of the sky, the sands on the shore, and the dust of the earth. Now, interestingly, by the time that Avram's life partner, Sarah, dies, neither has really been fulfilled. Avram owns no land, hence the lengthy negotiation with Ephron, and he has his son Yitzchak, but as yet sees no continuity to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is a single son, certainly far from multitude of nations which he is promised. And Rabbi Sacks develops a theme to try and understand this and the message implicit to it. And I want to develop this by looking at the psukim on the source sheet, on page 1 in the source sheet. I'll post again the link to that in the chat function. And I'll for those watching the recording, I'll post it in the description on the YouTube video. And I want to look at several of the psukim, just samples of the psukim, where this commitment is made to Avram. So we turn to page 1 of the source sheet. Vashem Omar al Avram. This is a pasuk from pre the Bris Milah. Achrei hiparid Lot me'imai, after Lot separates from him. Sana einachas, this is Parsha's Lech Lecha. Lift up your eyes. Urei min hamakom asher sham, tzafon of a negba of a kedem of a yoma. Ki has kol haaretz asher ata roya. For all the lands which you see, I will give it to you and your seeds forever. And then another example of this is in Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17. Establish a covenant between me and you and the seeds after you. To be as a God to you and to your family after you. I will give you and your seed after you. I will be to you as a God. Now, what's interesting in these psukim is something twofold. The first point is that Avram is not promised directly and openly that he will get this, but rather this is given in the context of a promise, a bris, a covenant. And we need to pause for a few moments and try and understand what is a bris and a covenant. The second commitment, which I see actually I didn't print in these psukim, and I should have printed this in the source sheet, is Avram is told to do something. So in chapter 13, in the psukim after those that I print over here in the handout, Avram is told you have to walk the length and the breadth of Eretz Yisrael, and that's the route through which you will acquire it. That's the route through which it will be given to you. So this is the psukim. These are the psukim of the gift of Eretz Yisrael. We now look at the psukim of children, of the promise of children, which I've also printed near the bottom of page 1, in the middle of page 1. And again, there's many psukim which this promise is made. And equally, in these psukim, one sees the commitment made in the context of a covenant. And not just a covenant, but again, Avram is told there's something he has to do. Perek 15, Perek Tesvav, Pasuk Hey, Pasuk 5. He's taken out. Look towards the heavens. Count the stars. If you're able, Lisbos, to count them. So will be your seed. So Avram is given something to do. He has to count the stars. And in chapter 17, again, a covenant. Ani hinei vrisi itzka. My covenant is with you. You will be a father of a multitude of nations, or you should be, perhaps. You should be a father of nations. So again, there's something Avram needs to do. I have made you a father of father of a multitude of nations. So again, this is given in the context of a bris. So what exactly is a bris? What exactly is a covenant? So this is something that Rabbi Sacks speaks about at length on many occasions. A bris is something too infrequently spoken about. We don't speak about it enough. It's not a small part of Torah. It's a significant part of Torah. In essence, the whole of the Torah is described as a Sefer HaBris, as a book of covenant with Hashem. So the Torah itself is a Sefer HaBris, a book of covenant. A covenant is what forms our relationship and our connection with Hashem. A covenant is the partnership engaged in, created between Hashem and the others, again and again, throughout the story of the others. Its partnership is created between the Jewish people and Hashem, the covenant throughout the sojourn through the Midbar, the giving of the Torah. Matan Torah is a covenant. There's other covenants made in Avos Moav, in the plains of Moab before they enter into Eretz Yisrael. And yet we very rarely stop and ask ourselves what a covenant is. And Rabbi Sacks explains, and this is crucial, that a covenant is a two-way relationship, and both aspects of this are important. It is not obvious that we should have entered into a covenant with Hashem. It is a two-way relationship. In every covenant, there's two sides to it. There's two commitments being made mutually to each other. And this is the first innovation, the first Kiddush. We would have thought that a relationship to Hashem would be one way. We would have thought it would be a commitment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a promise from Hashem to us, in which we are the passive recipients of his bounty. But this isn't the case. He wants a two-way relationship. And the nature of the relationship is also important. A covenant isn't just a partnership. A covenant isn't just a contract and a deal in which terms and conditions are laid out, like you may enter into a contract with a builder who's going to build something for you, or a worker who's going to provide a service. But it's a partnership, it's a relationship, it's a connection, it's an agreement and a recognition that we need to work together for both of us, for both sides, to achieve a goal that separately we wouldn't be able to achieve. It's a coming together, it's a connection and a merging within some degree or other, to some degree or another, of the roles and goals and identities of the two partners. A covenant, by the way, doesn't have to mean that it's a covenant of equals. It doesn't mean that both partners are committing the same amount. In fact, it isn't contractual. It isn't formed through a calculated cheshbon of how much am I giving and how much are you giving, as indeed doesn't happen in a true relationship. In a true relationship, one doesn't do the maths of how much are each of us giving. It's a sense of the coming together and each in our own way contributing to this connection. But when this connection is formed, we recognize, even if it's not a partnership of equals, nonetheless, we are each giving something into this relationship in order to achieve this goal that we aspire to. And this is the second element of a covenant. The third element of a covenant is that, therefore, by definition, it is something which has to be chosen. Again, it doesn't mean it's a choosing of equals. There may be a recognition that there's a dominant partner in the covenantal relationship, and there may even be an acceptance that, therefore, to a degree, this limits my flexibility, but ultimately it needs to be a choice. Ultimately, it's something that needs to be entered into freely. These are the features of a covenant, and each and every one of these are not obvious in our relationship to Hashem. Is, in fact, the very use of the language and the words relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is innovative. It's not obvious that this should be the term that we use at all. After all, the gulf between the two parties is infinite. We're talking about the absolute infinite on one side, and us, mortal, finite beings, on the other side. And the idea that a relationship exists at all is a chiddush. It's innovative. It's not something obvious. The use of the language of relationship that we use in our connection to Hashem derives from these pasukim that we are reading in these parshas of a bris, of a covenant between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Inherent in the covenant is that there's a connection. More than that, there's a connection, that it is a desired and wanted connection, because it can only be a relationship, it can only be a connection when there's a will and a desire on both sides. Not just a desire on our side, but a desire on the part of Hashem. A recognition that there are goals shared which can only be achieved through both parties, which itself is not obvious at all. What does it mean to say that the infinite, all-powerful, needs our contribution from us to form this bris, this covenant, and to achieve the shared goals? Do we even have shared goals? What does it mean to have shared goals with the divine? And there's all of this is inherent in the concept of bris. So deservedly, bris, a covenant, is an important key word in the Torah, in our relationships to Hashem, in our connection to Him, in the various ways I outlined, in the formation, in the beginning of the development of that connection with the Ovos and Emos, through its culmination in the time of the giving of the Torah and the entry into Eretz Yisrael. Covenant is not a simple concept, and certainly not a simple concept in the context of a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even the use of the term relationship with Hashem is not something that's obvious. And certainly, if there is a connection, the idea that it's not a contractual connection of a give and a take, but one of a genuine partnership, albeit not one of equals, is itself innovative. Now, what does the word bris mean? Where do we derive this from? So I printed in the source sheets again at the bottom of page 1. I see I didn't number the pages, but at the bottom of the first handout sheet, I printed from various Rishonim some thoughts around the meaning of the word. These are just two examples of how the Rishonim grapple with this grammatically difficult word. I printed the Ibn Ezra. This is about a third of the way down from the bottom on page 1 in the handout. Again, I'll post the handouts on the chat for those who as you have joined since I posted the link. The Ibn Ezra says that the root of the word bris is from that of choice and selection. He says, the word perhaps that we're familiar with is in the malachas, the prohibitions of Shabbos. There's a malacha called breira, bora, to choose, livra, to choose. The root of the word bris, according to the Ibn Ezra, is that of a choice. By definition, a covenant is a choosing. What does it mean it's a choosing? Number one, shabachu shnayim, that both parties have to choose. It's only a bris, a covenant that both parties choose. And there's also a selectivity to it. I'm choosing to enter into a covenant with you. I'm not choosing to enter into a covenant with someone else. All true relationships have to have an exclusionary element to them. If I claim to love everyone, I love no one. If I claim to be in a relationship with everyone, I'm in a relationship with no one. There has to be, by definition, a choice in a relationship. There has to be a selection in a relationship. In addition, there's a second element of selection to covenant, because we are choosing goals and targets and shared aspirations, which again are in the essence of a covenant. A covenant for everything is a covenant for nothing. So a covenant, in Ibn Ezra's thinking, the root of the word bris is livra, to choose, because I have to enter into a covenant freely, and I choose and select who I enter this relationship into and what the parameters and terms and shared goals of this relationship are. The Ramban gives a second suggestion as to the grammatical term bris, as to the meaning of this word bris. He does it in the context rather of Kabbalistic thought, as is well known. The Ramban Nachmanides, in his Parsha and Halacha, his commentary on the Torah, sometimes speaks the language of the Kabbalists, and we're not going to go into the Kabbalistic aspect of what he says, but in terms of the semantics and the lexicographical and the word explanation that he says over here, he links the word brit, to that of bria, of creation. And in fact, he says it is what's called in Hebrew a milah smucha, an attached word. So just like we have, the word simcha, which means happiness, and simchat, like simchat Torah, or simchat chassan akala, the joy of the chassan akala, the joy of the Torah. Similarly, he suggests there's the word bria, and then briat, the creation of, which is the root of the word bris, the word covenant. He said every covenant is the briat, the creation of something, because in truth, something new is being formed. A contract is not the creation of something new. I'm still me, you're still you. We enter into a contractual agreement in which I will give something and you'll give something else, and through that we will build a house or do some work or whatever it may be. A covenant of bris is not like that. There's suddenly a third element here. There's the relationship itself. Like in all relationships, in marriage, there's the husband, the wife, the spouses, but then there's the marriage itself that becomes a unit in its own right. It becomes a newly formed and newly created unit. The essence of a bris, the essence of a covenant, is that something new is being created, a recreation of the two individuals into one to some degree or other. So it's an act of creation and creativity. This, by the way, is why every covenant has a pain associated with it. Covenants don't come cost-free. If a contract is broken, it's possible just to unravel the contract. So fine, you haven't kept your contract. There may be penalties in the contract, there may not. You don't keep the contract, you give me back the money, I get back my object, and I resell it to someone else, or I get the refunds and I get a new builder to build the house for me. This is with a contract. With a covenant, it's a rupture. With a relationship, it's a negation. If we created ourselves together jointly into something new, with the breaking of the relationship, there's a tearing apart, there's a rendering, there's a ripping, there's a destruction of self, and therefore every covenant is bound up with pain if it is to be broken. And this is another feature that we find in the bris, the covenant of the Torah, that very often, they're not always, there's a sacrifice associated with it, a pain associated with it. It may be a sacrifice at the time of the making of the covenant, like the bris milah, the circumcision covenant, or the bris bein habasorim, the covenant of the parts, in which pieces are literally divided, and there's a sacrificial element to it. Or it may be a sacrifice built into the terms and conditions of the covenant, a recognition that if the covenant is ruptured, it will cause pain to both of us, such as the covenant of the tochacha, the covenant of the rebuke, both in Sefer Vayikra and in Bechukei and in Sefer Dvarim, when we read the tochacha. So this is another element to the concept of a covenant. And what we see in here, crucially, is that both these ongoing patterns of commitment made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Avram are done in the form of a covenant. The gift of Eretz Yisrael isn't a gift, it's a covenant of Eretz Yisrael. The gift and the promise and the commitment of a children and nationhood isn't a gift and a promise, it's a covenant. And therefore it's framed in the terms of the covenant, and it needs commitment and involvement from Avraham Avinu, as we saw from the Pesukim. When he's promised the land, he has to go outside and walk the length and the breadth of the land to acquire it. When he's promised children, he has to step out of the tent, he has to look at the stars, he has to count the stars, he has to commit to something in the relationship. What is the commitment of the relationship? As the Pesukim tell us, that we read at the top of the page, I will be for you as a God, a two-way relationship. I will be your God, but you will have me as your God. You will take on the name of Ram, and the new identity that you're formed. As we mentioned, the bris is a new identity. It's a naming ceremony, and you will have the responsibility now of being an Av Hamon Goyim, of a parent to a nation. So this is the bris bound up in the covenant that Avram makes in the gift of Eretz Yisrael and the gift of children. Linked to this, very linked to this, argues Rabbi Sacks, is the concept of a nisoyon, a trial. And again, this is a running theme through these sedras, that Avram in particular, but all the others in their own way, are subject to a nisoyon, nisayonot, to challenges, to tests, to trials. Now, the Mefarshim struggle to understand what a nisoyon is. What is a test? What's the concept of putting someone through a test? And here the thoughts of Rabbi Sacks are very akin to that of the Ramban, Nachmanides, not like the Ramban Maimonides in this particular area. And I printed on page, the top bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2, several sources around this concept of a nisoyon, around this concept of the challenge of a trial that is given. What is the purpose of a nisoyon? So the Rambam, in his guide to the perplexed in the Moreh Nevuchim, and I printed this at the bottom of page 1, and I printed it in English because, of course, all our access to the Moreh Nevuchim is in translation. The Hebrew edition of the Moreh Nevuchim is simply a translation from the Arabic. So if we're looking at translation, we might as well look in English. And at the bottom of page 1, the Mon Avachim says, and this is really a lengthy chapter. I've just taken 3 lines out of it. He said, so that human beings should know what is appropriate for them to do, understand or believe, to let us know how far the love of God knows, or to let us know the certainty that a prophet feels around the accuracy of their prophecy. So what the Rambam over here is saying is he's taking a sample of some of the nisyonos, some of the challenges that we see and perceive. If we ask ourselves, how far should a human be stretched? How far should we go for our love of Hashem? How much of our lives should we dedicate to strength of character, to belief, to self-development, to our relationship with Hashem? How far is the truth of prophecy meant to impact and on us as people? And to what degree were the prophets certain of their nevuah? So how do we answer these questions? We turn to role models. We look at the lives of the greats, and Avraham, and Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Moshe, and Aaron, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and we see how they lived their lives, and we learn from that what it is to live the good life. But what happens when we get to extremists? How do we learn the outer boundaries of these things? How do we learn how far love is meant to go? How do we learn how far belief in relationship to Hashem and to prophecy is meant to be? Only if our great role models are themselves stretched to the limit, such that we can understand and it can be made known to us how far we are meant to go and what the peak of human fulfillment and self-development can look like. And this, therefore, says the Mon Avachim, is the purpose of a nisayon, a trial, a test from Hashem, to make known to us, human beings, the extent to which a human can live their lives and be in a relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the reason the Rambam says this is as summarized by my source at the top of page 2, the Rabbi Zobin. Because the big problem with why Hashem tests us human beings is, of course, seemingly he knows the answer in advance. Why does he bother testing us? What's the test there to reveal? You give an exam, a test to an individual to see how well they do. If you need to mark a paper, if you need to prove their credentials, if they need to demonstrate what they know or what they're capable of. But to whom is a human being tested, demonstrating? Surely not to Hashem. And therefore, the Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed and some of the other figures that I posted over here said this is about serving as role models and as examples to us. So says these thinkers. The Ramban, Nachmanides, in the final source at the top of page 2, before we get onto the human development source, says that no, the purpose of nisayon, the purpose of a test, is not just to make known to others. This is too external. This is too superficial. The purpose of the nisayon, the purpose of the test, is in order to bring the individual out to their fullest potential. Until the point of the test, the individual is as yet untried. They may have great potential, but they don't yet have this actualized. They haven't yet developed and brought themselves out to the fullest extent. And therefore, the concept of a nisayon, a test, is from the point of view of the testee, not the point of view of the tester, not the point of Hashem himself, who of course knows the results, but for the testee who is put through this challenging and difficult and painful experience, and yet hopefully emerges from this, despite the pain and despite the difficulty, with something of growth and self-awareness from this. Now again, the Ramban doesn't mean to say that this is what we would choose. In fact, we are not meant to choose the path of test. Chazal criticize David, who appeals to Hashem to test him. David, the great King David, aspires for stature, for greatness. He wishes to achieve the status of the others, and he turns to Hashem and says, test me. And we know that indeed David had a very, very difficult life. This, of course, is not the approach. To pray and to hope for tests is not what we do. Tests are challenging, they're difficult, they're painful. But when we do get a test, there is something that we can draw out of it. There's a growth, there's a emergence of potential, there's a reminder of the value of the things that matter to us, of the sweetness of life, and the things that really count, which emerges from the test. And as painful as it is, used in its form, says the Ramban, is a development of what a person is capable of. We don't choose tests. We don't know why tests are given at particular times and stages and to whom they are given. But when they are given, we need to use them as a way of bringing out mehakach el hapol in the language of the Ramban, from the potential to the actual. That is where we go with a test. And this is a theme developed by Rabbi Sacks in numerous directions, based upon this covenantal relationship, this bris that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in which we are genuinely partnering with him in the outcome that we wish to achieve. Because ultimately, what is the outcome? What is the end goal that we have over here? A certain type of human development, not a selfish, self-centered maximization of self, but a human development out of which we emerge as moral and spiritual beings who have transcended the limits of what it means to be a merely physical body. And this, says Rabbi Sacks, is the secret of these parshias, these lengthy descriptions that we have read in the Sedra. Because whilst Avraham is promised Eretz Yisrael, whilst he is promised family and children and nationhood, the nature of the promise is that of a bris. The promise isn't, I will grant this to you. The promise is, I will engineer history to give you opportunities to achieve it yourself. I will walk with you hand in hand in a relationship, in a covenantal relationship, in the connection of bris, so that you can aspire and eventually achieve these goals, so that you can acquire for yourself Eretz Yisrael and eventually the building of nationhood. And this, as Rabbi Sacks, is the lesson of these lengthy parshias in our Sedra. Avraham is promised children, he's promised family, he's promised descendants, and yet look what he has to then do. A whole parsha which describes the journey of Eliezer to choose an appropriate wife for Yitzchak, someone who embodies in themselves, as indeed the great Rivka does, the values of the home of the others, the generosity, the kindness, the morality, the connection with Hashem. A whole journey needed through which, with great effort, Avraham is able to ensure the continuation of his family. Similarly, Eretz Yisrael, Sarah, his life partner, has died, and Avraham as yet owns nothing of Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael has to be granted through a bris, through a covenant. It has to be achieved through the opportunity, yes, presented by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but then acquired and achieved through us in partnership. Because it's only when we're in partnership with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that it is a bris. It's only when it's two-way, it's only when it's that relationship and that connection that it's indeed covenantally granted through us, and therefore deservedly given to us. And why is this? Why is it that this can only be given to us in this way? And here we contact the next great idea that I think runs through a lot of Rabbi Sacks' works, and which he talks about. And this is the value and the importance of human development and human achievement. Because of course, we human beings are only covenantal partners with HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we stand on our own 2 feet, when our achievements are indeed our own and freely entered into, as we saw in the language of what a bris, a covenant is. The essence of the act of creation that brought us into being is the creation not of slaves and servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but creation of creatures who are capable, at our best, of being partners with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what Sacks calls the ultimate gift of dignity. In creating the world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I've used this language before in the setting of the Shiur, engaged in an act of modesty. What is the act of modesty? It's the act of giving us space to be. A world in which there are mere automatons, robots, malachim, angels. There is no clouding of the visibility and the presence of Hashem, no withdrawal of the divine from the world, but equally no space for anyone to choose. In the act of creation of the world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates a space for us human beings to exist and to flourish, and in so doing, creates the possibility of wrong as much as the possibility of right. And this is integral to how the rest of Jewish history evolves and develops. And in founding Jewish people, in starting off the foundations of this journey with others, in the same way as the continuation of the history has to be that way, so to the start of the journey has to be like that. If it isn't like that, then this isn't the foundation of a nation. Eretz Yisrael and the birth of the nation cannot be given in any other way. A freely gifted foundation of a nation, a freely gifted land of Israel is a paradox, it's a contradiction in terms. Only an achieved covenantal through a bris acquiring of Eretz Yisrael can be a true Eretz Yisrael. Only an achieved and worked in partnership through a bris acquiring and struggling building of nationhood is true nationhood. Nationhood granted is a paradox in terms because it's not true nationhood. It isn't something built from within us. And therefore the only way HaKadosh Baruch Hu can promise the gift of Eretz Yisrael, the gift of future nationhood, is by saying, let's enter into a partnership. Let's enter into a covenant. Let's have a bris between us. Yes, I'm the Boren, I'm the creator of the world. I can create the setting, the scene, the opportunities, but then you, Avram, need to seize it. You need to grow and develop in order to make it. Because this is beyond my power, says the all-powerful. I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of infinite power and ability, can do everything other than give to a freely choosing being the removal of their choice. Because if I remove your choice, you cease to be Avram. If I remove your choice, you cease to be a human. If I remove your ability to choose, you cease to be the very being that can found what it means to be a Jewish nation and a Jewish homeland, Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael, the seed which Avram so desperately wants and is promised. The paradox can't be resolved. The only way HaKadosh Baruch Hu can give us that continuity in that land is through a bris, a covenant, in which we now need to work to achieve it. And therefore, when we are learning at length the story of Eliezer, the story of the finding of Rivka, the story of the acquisition of Eretz Yisrael with pain and money and blood, when Ephron, when a burial spot for Avram's wife is unattainable unless he purchases it at the moment of pain and despair and mourning, this is the essence of what it means to be gifted Eretz Yisrael, to be gifted children and continuity. And Rabbi Sacks now continues this idea by referencing a Rambam Monavuchim. It's a Rambam that I actually touched upon by coincidence in my Sunday morning philosophy share, but one which deserves looking at because this is so vital. And the Rambam argues in his Guide to the Perplexed, and Rabbi Sacks expresses this so beautifully in his writings, in which he says the very development of morality in the Jewish people is itself something that the Torah needs to sow the seeds of, but then blossom and flourish in its own right, at its own pace, when we human beings are capable of achieving it. And the Rambam uses a almost midrashic reading of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And when the Jewish people leave Egypt, Hashem says, I can't take you straight to the land of Israel. Kikorov here. It's too near, it's too close. You have to go slowly. You have to go through the desert. You have to take your time. And we know in the end this took 40 years, of course, to achieve. It takes time for you to leave in Egypt and get to an Eretz Yisrael. It's not possible to go straight there. What will happen if you go straight there? They'll see battle, you'll rebel, you'll end up running back to Egypt. You simply can't go straight to Israel. To move from slavery in Egypt to freedom and dignity and nationhood in Eretz Yisrael is something that by definition takes time. Says the Rambam, what do you mean it takes time? Surely God is capable of anything. And his answer in his Moan Avuchim, and I printed this on the middle of page 2 from the Guide to the Perplexed in the chapter, is it is true that God is capable of anything, but we human beings aren't. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do what he wants, but he doesn't want to do it all. He wants us to do it. And for us to be able to do it takes time. So says the Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed, in this reading of this brief statement at the start of Parsha Shiur that describes the journey of the Jews out of Egypt. Says the Rambam, this isn't just describing their journey out of Egypt. This is a metaphor, not just for a journey of 11 days, as was meant to be through the desert, not just for a journey of 40 years, as was the eventual journey through the desert, but also the journey of 3,500 years and counting since the events of Matan Torah and the Jewish people reaching the culmination of the spiritual and moral development at which we are meant to arrive. That itself is part of a journey. And the Torah sows the seeds, but we humans need to be ready for this. And I printed here in the continuation of page 2, I'm not going to read through all of this, a very beautiful piece in which Rabbi Sacks uses this to comment on some of the more difficult mitzvahs and concepts in the Torah. And he talks here about in the context of slavery. And he says, as much as we know the Torah created a wonderful and forward-looking vision of slavery, in which a master certainly has no right to abuse a slave, in which a slave who is indeed abused and beaten up by a master is automatically sent free. In the context of the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave, the slave is limited to a term of office. We're told that slaves needed to be treated as members of the household, where the standards of living is that of the members of the house, not just like members of the house, but if there isn't enough to go around to everyone, the slave is given priority to everyone else. A remarkable system of treatment of slaves. A slave who runs away in many cases isn't allowed to be returned. The metaphor, the saying used in Jerusalem of old at a time when these laws are practiced is whoever acquires a slave is like one who acquires a master, because the slave's care is so significant that they end up being treated better than members of the household. All very beautiful halachas of protection. But nonetheless, a slave is a slave. Nonetheless, how can it be that the Torah allows this way of connecting at all? Says Rabbi Sacks in his reading of the Rambam in Rachim that this is correct. The Torah plants the seeds of reminder of the dignity of every human being, even a slave. It reminds us that everyone is created with Tselem and Akim in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that in essence slavery is an abomination, an aberration, something terrible. But it also acknowledges where we are up to as a people. It also acknowledges the permissibility, not the mitzvah, but the permissibility of slave ownership. Maybe the economy at the time, maybe the nature of how life worked at the time, maybe other considerations. We're not yet ready for this in a culture embedded with slavery, for this to be completely removed. Change takes place. It's possible in human nature, but it takes time on a vast scale, sometimes, as he says, century or even millennia. There's no doubt in terms of the Torah values, he says, the exercise of power by one person over another without their consent is a fundamental assault against human dignity. But Hashem can't command that. Because if there's meant to be dignity between human and human, if there's meant to be dignity between master and slave, if there's meant to be dignity between king and subject, between ruler and ruled, there also needs to be dignity between Hashem and his creatures. A commandment, a mitzvah, which is out of sync with where we humans are up to. A command which is an imposition of values beyond those which are appropriate for the time, is itself an assault on human dignity, is in itself a contradiction with the very goal and message that needs to be delivered. And whilst perhaps obedience may be achieved, a true flourishing and flower of human spirit and human independence and the recognition of the dignity of every person will be set back by doing this, because it will counter the very goal itself, which is the arrival of us human beings of an appreciation of the worth and value of every life. And therefore some things can't be abolished, because they're abolished, they simply defeat the very terms and achievement that they're setting out to achieve. Yes, the particular wrong may be righted, but the true care and dedication and appreciation of everyone else won't be achieved, won't happen. And therefore there needs to be this process of bris, this process of covenant, this process of partnership, in which we are partners, not just in our relationships like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but even in how the values of the Torah unfold. So that over time, as indeed it happens, eventually we humans arrive at a realization that slavery is something that can't continue. And the final thought I want to share in line with this thinking is again a very beautiful and profound idea from Rabbi Sacks, which I printed at the end of page 3, around anti-Semitism and another aspect of the sort of covenantal relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Rabbi Sacks, in his comments around anti-Semitism, about which he unfortunately spoke a lot, particularly near the end of his career, when sadly he had to address these issues. Rabbi Sacks spoke a lot around the concept of anti-Semitism, and the point he tried to stress again and again is that anti-Semitism is not fundamentally about Jews. It's about anti-Semites. It's about people who can't accept responsibility for their own failures and have instead to blame someone else. And he says whenever there's an appearance of anti-Semitism in a culture, it's the first symptom of a disease, the early warning sign of a collective breakdown. When anti-Semitism is able to flourish, it's because this is a society that isn't able to tolerate the other, the one that's different. And we Jews are the peak expression of otherness. Our name is that of Ivri, And Ivri means many things, but amongst what it means is that of the alien, the eternal other. Chazal link it to the word Eva, the other side of the river. The whole world is on one side, and Avram, or Ivri, is on the other side. He's the essence of counterculturalism. His mission statement is to argue against the consensus, the conventions, the assumptions of the world, to think out of the box and to challenge that which everyone else is doing and question and say, really, is this the way it's meant to be? Is this where things are up to? And this continues to be our role. This continues to be the role of an Ivri, to be part of society and you're always a little bit outside, to be engaged with the world and you're always able to step back and critique it and question it and challenge it and question the assumptions and the norms of the culture around. We've discovered in recent years that the literal meaning of the word Ivri in ancient Semitic tongues, the Egyptians used this in their talk, that Aviru was the term they used for the wandering strangers, the aliens that used to enter into Egypt and eventually they enslaved. So Aviru means the alien, the Ivri is the permanent other, the different, a society which can't tolerate the gadfly of difference. It can't tolerate within its midst an Ivri, someone that's a little bit different, is a society which is proclaiming and revealing a profound disease and ill health in its essence. And he reads this very beautifully into the psukim that I printed from the opening promise given to Avraham Avinu right at the beginning of Parsha Shiur, when he first embarks on his journey. Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham, Vayomer, I see actually I've printed the name of Hashem here, so if anyone printed the handout sheets, please note that it does have Shemus in. I apologize this. Vayomer Hashem al Avram, Lechacha me'atzcha me'ladcha me'beitzavicha lo'etz hasharecha, the famous mission that Avram is given. I will make you a great nation. I will make you a nation. How will I make you a nation? As we've seen through this partnership, through this bris that we will enter into, which will then give you the opportunity to become a great nation. But then, those who bless you, your people, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. A nation that blesses you, a people that are able to tolerate an Ivri, an other, an alien, a different, a challenger, someone who is out of the box, who's questioning society and is able to tolerate and bless that Ivri which is found in its midst. That nation will be blessed. But a nation that curses you, that isn't able to tolerate that which is different, I in turn will curse. Not through an external mechanism, but through the internal dynamics of the nature of what it means for Hashem to be in partnership with humans. A nation that can't tolerate the Ivri, that curses the Ivri that's found in it, will be cursed because it has within it the seeds of its own destruction. A nation which blesses the Ivri that's found in it will be blessed because it has implanted in its national fabric the ability to thrive, to take advantage of the of the blessing that is open to all the families of the earth through the presence of the Ivri amongst them. So what we've seen in Rabbi Sacks' thought is a theme that runs through these sedras, in which he beautifully, as a Devar Torah on this sedra, explains the lengthy description of the continuation of Yitzchak, the effort that Avram has to go to in finding a Rivka, the effort that Avram has to go to in being able to purchase a small field and a cave of rocky land in the land of Israel, and shows us, points out to us, teaches us to understand that this is because the nature through which we acquire these things is that of bris, that of covenant. We saw the Rishonim, let's explain what the concept of covenant mean, that of nisoyon, that of the emerging of human development, and the paradox that this is the one thing that God, the Almighty Creator of the world, can't create. He can create everything other than human choice and human independence, which by definition has to be created by us. And therefore the only way these gifts can be granted is through that of bris, through that of freely entered into covenant, which builds a relationship, a dynamic in how the world operates. The bris operates in terms of the tochacha, the penalty we pay if we wish to rupture that relationship. It operates in the terms of the bracha given to Avram. If you are blessed by the nation within which you live, that nation will be blessed. If you are cursed by the nation within which you live, that nation will be cursed, because this is the fabric, this is the essence of what it means to be a human being. And in seeing how Avram, in partnership with Hashem, acquires Eretz Yisrael, acquires the continuity of his family, we go to understand what it means to be a human being in the thinking of Rabbi Sacks, and what it means to truly be in a covenantal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So I will stop here for today. I'll thank everyone for, as always, for joining and for giving me this opportunity to share some Torah. And next week we will go back to our normal format of half an hour of Parsha half an hour of halacha. Please God, hopefully back face to face in a resumed share. But thank you all so much for as always for joining and for being part of this Torah learning.
Thank you.